welcome. Thank you for joining us in our Q&A session on cybersecurity and data privacy. I'm financial advisor Wendy Turk here with Gerber Kawasaki, and joining me today to answer all of my questions is privacy attorney Diana Iketani Iorlano. Diana has over 22 years of experience as a business lawyer and strategist. She represents clients of all sizes, specializing on privacy and security, entertainment litigation, general business litigation, and government and regulatory actions. She has a whole litany of certifications and memberships, specifically dealing with privacy. Diana, is there anything you want to add about yourself?
Oh, I'm just so thrilled to be here, Wendy. Thanks so much for asking me to come and answer these questions. I'm a bit of a privacy geek, as you know, because we've talked about it, but I'm just thrilled to be here. So thank you so much.
So before we get started, I have the fun things to get out of the way. The first is the disclaimer. Any information that we discuss here is for educational purposes only and is not to be taken as financial or legal advice. Please consult your financial or legal professional for any questions you have that pertain specifically to your situation. So with that out of the way, I think ever since March, a lot of us have been at home. We got our stay-at-home orders here in California, and people are now working in their homes. They're working from vacation homes. They might even be working from their car if they're trying to get away from the kids or find a quiet place. I know for me personally, I have at least one Zoom meeting a day. I send multiple DocuSigns, and I feel like I send 1 million emails, and I'm sure that that's the case across the country. So given that, and given the impact that COVID might have going forward, what do you see being any concerns regarding privacy to our data, cybersecurity, digital everything?
I think it's a great question. I think that in the age of COVID, everybody is really worried about, am I more at risk than I was before COVID? And the answer is no. COVID didn't change our privacy concerns. I think it brought them to the forefront. I think it really amplified them for a larger group of people to now be working remotely, to have to think about things like internet security and, what types of information you're getting and sending to people has just put it at the forefront. So I think all of these issues have been around for a really long time with privacy, as shown by new laws that are being passed. Specifically in California, we had something called the California Consumer Privacy Act that went into effect in January. And, they're pushing for federal privacy legislation. So I think COVID didn't change anything other than it made more people aware of the existing perils of data security and privacy.
Right. I think with everybody moving home, generally speaking, most people were in an office, and whatever the Wi-Fi was at your office or whatever protections you had, it was pretty much governed by the system that they put in your workplace. But now that everybody is at home, is encryption more important? Are there certain areas or types of businesses that might have greater liabilities?
Absolutely. I do think that now that we are all working from home, there's a lot of steps that people need to take to make sure their home systems, their home Wi-Fi, their routers are secure in a way that we'd all hope that they were before, but now it's even more important. And if you're in a field like you, Wendy, in financial services, in a highly regulated field like financial services or healthcare, anywhere you're dealing with sensitive personal information of your clients or of yourself, you really need to have that heightened awareness, making sure that you change the default password on your Wi-Fi router so it's not the one that came in the box.
Right.
Or it's not just an open Wi-Fi. I think that those are things that people sometimes take for granted, saying, well, it's just my personal stuff, or I'm just streaming Netflix. It's not that big of a deal. But now, as an employee, as an owner of a company, it really is important to reach out to those folks who are working at home to make sure that they've implemented the right security on their systems, because you don't have as much control. And for some people, it's a real struggle to figure out, what do I need to do? How can I upgrade my system to make sure that I have those protections in place? So I think savvy business owners might put out a list of best practices, what they want. If people are using password protected Wi-Fi's, if they want them to have a virtual private network or a VPN at home, is that something the company provides so that you have a secure method of data transmission? And are you having your employees save things on the cloud? Are they saving them to their home computers? Are you giving them computers to take home? All of those things are considerations about the security of the company's information now. So encryption is always the best way to go. Even some of our laws will say that if data is encrypted and breached, it's not as big an offense as if it were unencrypted and breached. So learning how to encrypt things both at rest when it's on your system or on your server or on your cloud, and then also in transmission via email or anything else, using secure methods to do that, I think has become very, very important with everybody working from home.
Right. I mean, we hear things about Zoom bombings, data breaches. If we think about companies, generally speaking, do you feel that, Zoom is better than FaceTime, or Teledoc is ahead of the curve versus some of the other platforms that are out there?
I think that they're all great questions. And I think that we've seen, even with Zoom, right, when Zoom became very popular right after we had our shutdown, there were a lot of concerns about privacy in Zoom and the ability to Zoom bomb. And Zoom, like any good company, you would hope would respond with improvements. And so I think that you're going to see a lot of improvements and a lot more security built into these systems as time goes on and as their user rates go up. So with Zoom, I think that you have to consider what you're using the technology for. So if you're using it for a secure meeting, maybe it's a shareholders meeting, maybe it's the board meeting before the shareholders meeting, you may want to use a more secure platform. And obviously FaceTime is limited because it's for Apple users, but it has limited capabilities, right? So you don't necessarily have a password to get into a FaceTime. You don't know if somebody's recording the FaceTime on their side of the phone. But Zoom there are still limitations on what you can and should do on Zoom. You also have companies like WebEx, or there's a number of companies that are coming up. I think you need to review the ratings of those companies, what people are saying about their privacy policies and practices, and what the leaders of the company are saying. Are they dedicated to preserving your information, or is it a free service where you're getting it for free and they're trying to get information from you because you're not paying anything for the service? Right. I think we've talked about, you and I, Wendy, in general, when you're using a free service, there is a question in the back of your mind of, if I'm not paying for the product, then maybe I am the product and my information is the product. So, typically you're going to get more protection in a paid product than you are in a free product. So it's something to think about.
Right. So true. I mean, I don't think most people think about that when something is free, how free is it really in the grand scheme of things? Do you think that protections like HIPAA are at risk for some companies? I think a lot of doctors have been moving more to telemedicine. And then additionally, I mean, what do you think about file upload services like Dropbox or something where you put your information in a portal?
I think that the healthcare world is really sort of above and beyond the curve right now, because they have had HIPAA in place for a lot longer than some of these other privacy laws. And just to go back, privacy is guaranteed in state laws and federal laws and international laws, but it's also guaranteed by our state constitutions, our federal constitutions. So the concept of privacy has been around forever, right? That you have the right to privacy in your home and things like that. Transitioning that into a digital world has proven very difficult, as many of our laws have proven difficult as technology evolves. So I think with HIPAA, it is only going to cover certain types of entities, right? I think some of us have seen folks going into, the store and saying, this is a HIPAA right that I'm, maybe it's a mask-free person, and they're saying, you're violating my HIPAA rights. You're not. The HIPAA isn't for, individual to individual transactions. So I think it depends on who the organization is, right? If it's a healthcare organization and it's a covered entity under HIPAA, then that means that they have to comply with those laws. But even right now during COVID, the Department of Health and Human Services has said that they will relax some of the violations of HIPAA because of the need for telemedicine, because of the immediate need within this public health emergency to have better access. So even those laws that are in place, there may still be violations, but there may not be sanctions for those violations, or they may not be enforced. So I think that we all sort of sit back and go, well, no, everything's going to protect me. I think that these are just strange times during COVID where some of the regular protections don't apply. So as people move to telemedicine and telehealth, it really is, it depends on your relationship with your doctor. It depends on what hospital they're affiliated with. I think that we've seen major hospitals in Los Angeles have data breaches. So, I think that it depends, right? In all likelihood, your doctor is not going to ask you to FaceTime with them. I do have a pediatrician, though, that sometimes will say, like, hey, send me a picture of what's going on with your kid. That existed before. It's a great benefit for freaked out parents who are at home just trying to get an answer. And I think that's going to be on a case-by-case basis with what your physician feels comfortable with and what type of condition they may be trying to treat via telemedicine. But generally, you're not going to want to transmit personal or confidential information over, unsecured lines. So I think that it's incumbent upon us as individuals to really evaluate how sensitive is this information and do I want to share it via telehealth, or do I want to pick up the phone and call my doctor and explain it and then maybe have a follow-up appointment. I think it really is about the patient and the clients really exercising those rights and exercising some judgment for sure.
Right. Do you feel like portals where you upload your information are any safer? Are they more secure?
I think they can be. And typically, I'm always going to advocate for using something to upload where you have a secure method of transmitting that information. So if it's somebody has to send you a link and then they have to send you a password, that's great because you know that it needs to be passworded. For things like Dropbox, they have those options, but oftentimes people will just send you a link to their Dropbox.
Right.
And then that link can be forwarded to multiple people. So you don't have control over just sending the link. I would always recommend sending it in some sort of a method that includes a link and a password or some other, even if it's a timed login where you only have access for a certain amount of time. Those types of things can protect your transfer of information.
Okay, so thinking about HIPAA and general privacy for the individual, a lot of us are returning back to work. I know that Gerber Kawasaki had some guidelines of how to re-enter the office, how to re-enter the workforce. And all of us had to read it, all of us had to sign it, and presumably we're all adhering to it. But given that there are so many more policies, what is the employer responsible for, and how much privacy as the employee can we expect?
First of all, I sympathize with any companies that are doing return to work policies right now because the goalposts are moving all the time. So keeping up on what the current, whether it's a federal guideline, a state guideline from your governor or from your mayor or from your county, it is an enormous task in and of itself just to keep up with what the existing regulations are to return to work. I've been working on a lot of return to work policies in conjunction with employment lawyers. I'm a privacy lawyer, so I'm working on what kind of data can employers collect from their employees to go back to work? So it's a monumental task. I think it is incumbent upon individuals who are returning to work to read the policy and also understand whether that makes them feel comfortable in this public health emergency of returning to work. And if you don't feel comfortable with what your employer has set up, talk to your coworkers. Are there others that feel uncomfortable? Because there's always strength in numbers to go back to your employer and say, hey, we think that maybe we'd feel more comfortable if you did X, Y, and Z. But that being said, go ahead.
Sorry. If my employer wants me to submit to a temperature check every day, is that allowable? Or can they request that everybody be COVID tested? Is that something that they can ask of all of their employees?
It's a great question, and it's one I get a lot. And yes, your employer, your private employer, can ask you to submit to a temperature scan daily if that's what they believe. And we all know, though, that we've heard information that maybe temperature scans are not indicative of, whether you're COVID positive or not.
Right.
So there are limitations. Same thing with a COVID test. Your employer can ask you to provide a negative test in order to return to work. But how long are those results good for? So I think that a robust return to work has to take these things into consideration and understand that it may be fluid. I think that the idea of knowing who's coming into the office each day so that if someone gets tested positive, you can inform them. I think that's important. I think for employers from a privacy standpoint, you don't want to collect more personal health information than you need to. So if it's a temperature scan that is just you have a fever or you don't, that person gets to come in and there's no reason to keep that information. If there's a gatekeeper who's making that admission control decision, you don't need to write down every employee's temperature. Why would you need that information? It's just, that's personal health information. You're connecting it to a person's name. I don't think you need to do that. If it's just that decision, you get to come in today or not, fine. Can you ask them to self-report? Yes, you can ask them to self-report. But I think you'll still have those issues. But private employers on private property can choose what they want to do to have their employees come back to work within reason, right? You're not going to be doing blood draws at your office, most likely, unless you're a hospital. So I think it is a reasonableness thing. And I think it's hard when we're in the middle of a public health emergency for people to sometimes remain reasonable, as we've seen in the news. So I think employers really need to look at that idea of what is reasonable. If I were the employee, what would I believe was reasonable for my employer to ask of me to return to work safely?
Right. So let's say that I test positive and I tell my employer, what reasonable expectation do I have to have privacy about that health record? Going back to kind of the HIPAA question, it's now falling into the realm of employee-employer. Should I be concerned that everybody will know that I got COVID? Not that I got COVID, but what if I did?
Right. And I think we have to, again, look at this through the lens of what existed pre-COVID, right? It was, if you came into the employment, your place of employment, and told them you were diagnosed with any illness, it is incumbent upon your employer to keep that diagnosis confidential. With the additional public health emergency that we're in, though, the employer may need to tell people somebody in the office did test positive. They work in this department. They should not be identifying you by name, but in some businesses that are smaller, it may be impossible for people not to know who it is, especially if one day, 5 people are at work and the next day only 4 people are at work and someone was diagnosed positive. So again, it's a reasonableness idea, which is the employer should not disclose the identity of the individual, but if other people deduce it, there's not much that we can do about that. That being said, anybody who is diagnosed COVID positive at this point has hundreds of thousands of people who are in company with them. I think that the idea that we want to control the spread of the virus is a compelling one where there shouldn't be a stigma attached to that. It is obviously a personal choice, and your personal information is always your personal information. But I think you have to inquire of your employer, like, can you keep my identity confidential? I know you have to, if you're really concerned about those things. But yeah, I think for health reasons and safety reasons, it's like any other diagnosis. If somebody were injured and got cut at the office, and you want to warn people not to go into that area because it's a dangerous area, you may disclose that it's somebody who works in this department and we're looking at that issue. So viewing it through the lens of a pre-COVID world of knowing employment, basically under basic employment law, that you do need to keep diagnoses confidential. That's what we look at it through.
Right. Seeing as how it's so important that we do track where the virus is going or where it's been, I know that a lot of the world is reopening. A lot of California has reopened. We don't know if it will close again, but we have restaurants that allow dine-in. Disneyland was set to open again, which got delayed in California, but Florida might open. How do you feel about contact tracing? Is that a good solution? And should we as individuals be thinking about what contact tracing means?
Again, I'm going to go back to this concept that contact tracing has been around for decades. It is not something new that came about with COVID. That being said, more people are aware of it now, and we understand that it might mean that they're going to ask you who you've associated with recently. Contact tracing is not something to be feared. It is something that is used, for instance, if there's an E. coli breakout based on some sort of a food, at a restaurant that a bunch of people ate at, or a recall of meat products or any product, right? That's all done through contact tracing. So these concepts have been around for many, many years, and they work, right? We can now tell people down to a lot number that, hey, you need to take that, box of cereal off your shelf, or that package of pork. Those are really important public safety things to be able to do. I know people are freaked out that now both the Android and the iPhones have this new COVID-19 tracking information. And no, nobody downloaded anything into your phone. There was an update that has a functionality that if you download a contact tracing app, it may be able to work with that. But contact tracing is not to be feared. I think it will actually really speed up notification. Contact tracers are trained, they are certified, they are required to adhere to confidentiality rules. So I think it's important to understand that these are just people doing their job. Sure, could you refuse to talk to them? Sure, you could. But I think that unless you want to go call every single person that you've been around to tell them that you got diagnosed or potentially are diagnosed, letting the contact tracers do that work for you is usually much more efficient. And I think it's letting the system work the way it was intended to. And no, they're not keeping a dossier on you. They really don't care, except for that, trying to get the message out for people to be able to protect themselves. And they're not going to compel you to, be quarantined. They're going to make recommendations and tell you, this is what we recommend that you do. We would ask that you quarantine yourself, your family, but they're not bringing the sheriff with them, during that first call. And typically those contacts are made during phone calls. So pick up the phone, answer the questions, and I think that we can all get through this a little bit faster. Hopefully, that would be my recommendation anyway.
In terms of the apps that use Bluetooth, can you speak a little more about how that works? How does the Bluetooth communicate to know where you've been and know that, oh, you were in this store and somebody tested positive? How does it know to send you the notification?
Right. So it won't do it unless you download one of these contact tracing apps, or you give an existing app that you have this contact tracing capability. But typically, a lot of us use Bluetooth, and a lot of us use our cellular signal. So the technologies may vary from app to app on the contact tracing, but typically what they're going to do is send out an anonymous beacon. It's not tied to your identity. It may be tied to your device, but it's just a beacon. And what it'll do is it'll light up if you've been in contact with someone else's beacon for 10 minutes or more, or whatever period of time. And it may light up that you're geolocated at the Starbucks, sorry, Starbucks, and somebody was diagnosed or reported, self-reported into this app that they were diagnosed positive. The information doesn't get activated until someone makes that report. So you could be going through your day and have a beacon and it will, show that you were here or there. Nobody gets that information until it triggers somebody who may have been in contact with you for some period of time or at a location you were at. So I think it's really fascinating, geeky technology for me, to think about the idea of sort of triangulating where somebody is and how long they're in contact with somebody. And if you're a fan of any of the forensic shows like CSI, or you watched, listened to the Serial podcast where you heard about, how they were using cell phone towers to ping things, it's that same kind of technology that, frankly, sometimes people expect, and it doesn't exist all the time, but it's along the lines of that. So it's exciting and different and new, but you have to download the app, you have to grant the permissions for it to do this. So.
Right. And we shouldn't be worried, right? I mean, if we have Find My iPhone set up on our phone, that's not that much different.
Right. And I think that's exactly right, Wendy. A lot of people who use Waze on a daily basis, right? Then they're very upset that their location services is on for some other app. But Waze is using your location every time. In fact, its functionality depends on you having your location services on. So when we look at privacy and we look at those things, you have an enormous amount of options right in the palm of your hand. And, I would say, for good digital hygiene, maybe one of those nights when you're sitting in bed and you would normally be scrolling through Facebook or YouTube or reading the news, go through and look at your settings, go into that little gear button and look at your settings, look at your privacy settings, see what information you're sharing with your apps, because the Bluetooth technology, you have it on if you have an Apple Watch like I do. If you use a headset, your Bluetooth is on, right? So it's not any different than the same information you're giving out when you use those convenience items along with your cell phone. So I think people can get upset about these things, but they forget that they're using the same technology everywhere in their digital life. They can also make the choice not to use it, to shut off location services on their phone, to shut off microphones on their phone. But those are things that are built in for the user to make those choices as well.
Right. I think that we as adults who use this technology, that is something that we've gotten used to. It's something that is just part of daily life. But something that has been new, at least for me, and probably your household too, is we have distance learning. My kids before COVID watched maybe an hour of TV a day. Now they're on the computer for several hours doing schoolwork. They're using apps. They're going onto websites. For my kids, we use the Seesaw platform. I know some schools have gone to Google Classroom, and then they additionally link to external websites like Raz Kids, Reading A to Z, Scholastic, to provide supplemental material. And that's not something that my kids have really been exposed to. Is this something that we should be concerned about as parents?
Absolutely. I think it's absolutely incumbent upon us as parents. And I hate to impose any additional burden on parents right now, because I feel for you. I am a parent, and I know that this is doing double, triple duty every day that you're at home. To ask you to read one more privacy policy or do one more thing is an incredible burden. But I think that just like we want to educate ourselves as to the safety of our apps, we want to especially look at what's happening with our children. And again, this is very dependent on what age your children are too, because obviously younger children have no ability to consent to what's in a privacy policy or to even understand the concept of a password and why it's being used. So I think the more that we have an open dialogue with our children about what privacy is, why we don't use our address as our password or our dog's name as our password, I think that it's a lifelong learning opportunity So I think that that's important. But I think also it's incumbent upon parents to have a dialogue with the administration at your school. And I even go as far as suggesting that you find out if there's some sort of privacy committee with your parent-teacher organization where you're looking at the technology, or you have people in the community who know a little bit about it. Maybe you've got a parent who's in tech, maybe you've got a parent who's a lawyer. Having folks who have that desire to look into these things. I mean, one of the things too is that a lot of the schools have default passwords, right? And we need to be changing those default passwords. You're allowed to change those default passwords to something that works, but then you have to make sure your kid knows what the password, the new password is. And I think, in this age of cyberbullying and issues like that, it is important to check in on your kids. As a parent, you do have the right to look at what your kid's doing. And a lot of apps have that built in. A lot of what I found at my son's school, they do have some apps that have a parent interface. So I can, as a parent, log in and see what my child has been doing. I encourage you to get a little bit more information about that. I also want to recommend a website called commonsensemedia.org. It's a great site for not just for children, but for grown-ups to check and sort of learn about which apps are safe or safer. So again, that's commonsensemedia.org. It's a great resource to just sort of, it'll give you tips about how to set up a proper password. What should you really put into a password so that it can't be guessed by somebody? Do you need to give accurate answers to those challenge questions like, what was your high school mascot? Because everybody I went to high school with knows the answer to that question. So I think you really need to start thinking about those extra layers. When celebrities get hacked because their IMDb or their Wikipedia says what their mother's maiden name is. Of course, you can't be using that information because it's so easy to find in an obituary, in, an online thing, or in ancestry.com these days. So definitely things to think about. And with the children's privacy, engaging in a dialogue with not just your child, but also with the school, I think is important.
What rights do we as parents have for schools who may want to use our child's image in their Facebook page? Or, my son has Zoom classes, and I know that his teacher would sometimes post on the classroom Instagram a picture of the Zoom where all the kids are participating. I assume that nobody is using that for nefarious purposes, but at the same time, I don't know.
Right. I think that schools should have a privacy policy or some sort of a consent from parents at the beginning of the year that says, I consent for you to use pictures of my child. That being said, if you know that the photos are happening in the classroom, I would love for us to go back to a world where we talked face-to-face with people or on the phone with people to say, hey, I've got a concern about my child. Talk to the teacher and say, I'd prefer that you not use my child's photo. Have that proactive dialogue early if it's a concern of yours. I think having it after the fact and then having it blow up because somebody posted something on a Facebook page, it doesn't end well for anybody, and it leaves everybody with a bad taste in their mouth. So I think most teachers want to do the right thing. If it's, hey, can you, put heart stickers above the kids' faces instead of showing their faces if it's going to go beyond our classroom. I have seen other classrooms limiting it to Shutterfly, so it may be information that's just shared within the class, and then there's an instruction that goes up to say, like, please don't download these pictures and distribute them. They're for your personal use only. I think that having somebody who's aware of those issues is important, which is where a privacy committee at the school might be helpful.
Got it. You and I have relatively younger children, but I have a lot of clients who have middle schoolers and high schoolers, and they're fine doing distance learning, but they have all this time on their hands. So now they're on TikTok or Instagram or Facebook or any number of other social media apps. What should parents of older kids be aware of?
Again, I hate to burden parents with any additional duties right now, but you've got to be proactive. You got to educate yourself and learn a little bit about these apps. Sometimes it can be fun. It can be, doing a TikTok video with your child. But you should be reading the privacy policies. You should be reading the news to see what's happening. You would find out that TikTok had a massive enforcement action against them for sharing children's privacy, children's data. And I think you also have to look at the origin of the app. TikTok was created in a jurisdiction where they're very used to a free exchange of information. In fact, they get to see every bit of information that you upload to an app. So I think when you look at those things, be aware of it. There are nefarious uses of information, whether it's coming from an app that's designed in Russia or something like that. So understanding the origin of the app, looking at the FTC's website too, the Federal Trade Commission does a lot of enforcement actions in privacy. So if you see that the FTC has fined somebody for privacy violations, that information is all public record. Do a quick Google search and talk to your children about it, right? Talk to them about the permanence of a digital record. That video that seemed really cute last week when they were 13 may be embarrassing when they're 17. And if it went viral, could destroy their career when they're 21. So talking and having a dialogue with our children about that, I think, is really important. I realize even just having a discussion with your teenager is a struggle these days. But again, knowing, the kind of media and the apps that you consume, how they're different from the ones that your kids consume, and talking about responsibility. We all know that when we were 13, 14, 15 years old, we probably lacked a lot of the judgment to make really good decisions for our adult life. So helping folks, your own children, navigate those waters, or even if you're an uncle or an aunt to a child, talk to them about something that embarrassed you on the internet and see if that you can engage in that dialogue. I do think it takes a village, especially digitally, to have people say like, hey, you really shouldn't post that. That's offensive. That's racist. That's any number of things. That's too risque. I think that we can help each other out there, especially when it involves minor children who shouldn't be posting those types of things anyway.
So truly the internet is forever?
Pretty much. I think we've seen that where, folks say, there's always a tweet. Yeah, we can go back and search for old tweets. We can go back and search for old posts. There's something called the Wayback Machine, which basically pulls what the version of a website looked like on a specific day in the past.
Wow.
So it's the technology is there and it is being recorded for posterity. So, but then that also means technology is super helpful, but technology can be damaging. So pick and choose what you digest, what you consume. Maybe think twice before you post that thing on a public chat board or a public comment section. Is it necessary? Is it kind? Is it something that might embarrass me? Like when I wake up tomorrow morning, maybe take a pause and figure out whether you want that digital information out there about yourself. Because there was a time where we didn't comment on everything and we didn't feel like everyone needed to have an opinion on everything. I'm not saying people shouldn't have opinions. They absolutely should.
They just shouldn't press the little send button sometimes.
Yeah, just that little delay. And even on things like, you can actually send your emails on a delay so that you have that moment of like, oh gosh, should I delete that? You actually can build that into your email. It's great.
I know that we talked about kids, but I'm at the age where now I have to watch over what my parents are doing. I have had several incidents where my parents get hacked or they accidentally download a virus. And basically my solution with my brother is to just go and buy a new computer rather than risk having a big data breach. Are there ways that we can kind of police our parents?
Yes, but I think it depends on the willingness of your parents, right? So I think, again, it's about engaging in that dialogue like you would with your children about, hey, by the way, there's this danger of these phishing emails, PHISH, phishing emails where people are trying to get your information. Explaining to them that nobody should be asking for their social security number over the phone. I think my parents are in their late 80s and my dad is 90. And they just come from a different generation where you were much more trusting. And if somebody said they were calling from the Social Security Administration, my goodness, they must be very important. But my 90-year-old father, he had an interaction on the web where it was somebody tried to take over his computer and download some or upload some executable files on his computer. He knew enough to hang up the phone, to turn off his computer, to call my sister and myself and have us, come over and do something. It was pre-COVID, unfortunately. It's much more difficult now during COVID where we can't always see and physically help our parents. So, making sure that they have a good antivirus. Even in some instances, if your parents are willing to be able to have that bridge where you can actually remote into their computers. If you use an iCloud account, there's actually the ability for someone to remote into another computer using that iCloud account. So my sister has actually been able to use that to help my parents out quite frequently, even when my dad just couldn't get on a Zoom call with all of the kids. So there can be very useful ways to do that. But I think educating them about what type of information is appropriate or what will be asked of you or what won't. Sometimes it's just forwarding an email to your parents about a certain article that you read that, my dad's a big one. Actually, my father-in-law is a big one for forwarding emails to me about current events. So, it's a great way to connect with them, especially right now where they may not have a lot of interaction. Send an email or cut out a newspaper article or cut out something and mail it. Say like, hey, this is something you need to think about, and have a follow-up call for that. I think that there's a massive, massive amount of people who are targeting seniors for this because they are trusting and because they have assets, frankly, right? So you've got a population of people that may have a lot of money in the bank or anywhere else, and it's really easy to prey on them. But there's still very common identity sorts of cons, right, that have been around forever where, someone will call your parent and say, Auntie so-and-so, it's your nephew. And they'll volunteer the name and they'll be like, yeah, it is your nephew. Yeah, that's the person. I'm in jail. I need money. Can you wire me, money? Or my friend will come and pick up, $500 in cash from you. I think those types of scenarios tear at our heartstrings. And it's awful to see people be taken advantage of that way. But talking about those hypotheticals, not scaring everybody, but talking to your friends about, what they've done with their parents. How do they keep their parents safe? Talking to somebody who's in tech, saying like, is there something I can do with my parents' computer? Changing settings on your parents' computer so that they don't have, location services on all the time, things like that. I mean, I think digital hygiene, again, if you go and get that opportunity to go visit your parents, do a quick checkup on their computers and see whether things are working right. And all this assumes you have a good relationship with them. So I realize there are limitations, but I think it's similar to what we experience with our children for sure.
Yeah, speaking of malware and executable files, I've always wondered how many of my devices are listening. There was one time that I was talking to some coworkers about Hot Pockets, and I haven't had Hot Pockets in maybe 20 years. And then the very next day, I get an ad for Hot Pockets in my Facebook feed. Was Siri listening to me? Is everybody else listening to me? Will I now get ads for Hot Pockets again because I said it?
And now I want a Hot Pocket because I haven't had one in 20 years. Yes, they are listening. But odds are you gave them the right to listen. So when an app asks you whether you're going to grant microphone access or access to your contacts or access to your camera, really consider what you're giving, right? Because they're not limiting it to, not always. You may be able to limit it to only when you're using the app, but more often they're using it all the time. So the Internet of Things, right? You have an Amazon Echo, you have a Google Mini, you have all these different items that are in your house and listening. You have your Siri. Yeah, a lot of times they're listening, but a lot of times it can be things that you've clicked through. You clicked through on a website that showed an ad for Hot Pockets, and or you Googled Hot Pockets, because I think people see this a lot, right, on especially on Facebook and other places where you'll do a search for, a screwdriver. And then all of a sudden you start getting pictures of screwdrivers in your feed and you're like, oh, that's
How do they know?
right. But it can be something as easy as, hey, I liked this, home improvement group on Facebook, so now they're pushing home improvement tools to my feed. Or it could be that they've clicked on some search that you did in another browser, even if it wasn't in Facebook, but you looked at it in Safari or in, Internet Explorer, it can be pulled through. Or if you sent an email through Gmail, we know that Gmail uses artificial intelligence to sort of pull out keywords in your emails and serve ads to you. So another thing that people can do even today is sort of look at some of these ad service things, Google Analytics, Oracle Data Cloud. There are these third parties that are working on most of the websites that you visit that are sort of collecting information about you. It may be anonymized, meaning they won't say, oh, it's Diana Iketani who has this, but they may know that I'm a woman, that I'm Asian American, that I'm in a certain age range, which I won't disclose.
They'll have to keep guessing.
and then it'll say, but she's been shopping at these sets of stores, so maybe we're going to push these ads to her. Oracle Data Cloud is something you can go on, you can Google it. There's an opt-out for the third-party advertising that's pushed by Oracle Data Cloud, and I have the website. It's datacloud.oracle.com. That's a website you can go to, and I guarantee you'll be frightened at the amount of information that's out there about you. But you can opt out, and that's done by device, so it doesn't follow you around the internet. But each device that you have, you could do an opt-out. But read the privacy policies too, because it'll tell you, what Facebook is using your information for, and it's a lot. But when you signed up for that account, you consented to those terms and you consented to give them certain information. But you always have the control, right? You can join groups on Facebook, you can like stores, but then everybody gets that information, right? They want to know that you like Pure One. Sorry, they're going out of business, or J. Crew. That information has a value. So if you don't want to get those ads or things like that, then don't like those things. Go through again, whether you time it with your dental appointment twice a year, you go through and you check your things and say, you know what, I'm going to go through and I'm going to unlike or unfollow these things because I don't want to keep getting those ads, or I don't want people to know that much about me. I think that people get really frustrated with what's out there about them, but they are in fact putting it out there. Even with things like Ancestry.com, where you're giving your DNA to a database, they have a privacy policy. I'm not sure how many people read it. We're now seeing, the Golden State Killer was identified through DNA in one of these registries. So, and that becomes a bigger problem, right? Because if my brothers and sisters put in their DNA, I never have, but people have a pretty good picture of who I am because my relatives may have done that. The world is sort of, it's creeping in a little bit. So I think it's incumbent upon all of us to make really good decisions about where we want to share that information.
Mm-hmm. We did get a question. What is the purpose of covering minors' faces in public-facing media? So when people won't show pictures of their kids on Facebook, or if you ask your school to black out your child, why would we do that?
Well, I think the important thing to consider is that children can't give consent. Yes, we as parents could give consent for our children, but children themselves can't give consent, and they will at some point become a functioning adult that has all the rights of privacy that you and I have today. So just like I could ask my friend, please don't put up my picture for whatever reason. Children should have that right, and they don't typically have that right. So it's a best practice. I think you always want to get the parents' consent before you share a photo of someone's child. So if you have a group of friends or if you have a school picture, you can email it to your family. You don't need to post it on Facebook if it has 30 kids in it and you're not going to get consent from those parents, and you're not. So consider what you want to do. Yeah, you can display it in your home. You can put it up on your wall. That's not public facing. So I think it's about respecting the minor's right to privacy, but also exploitation, right? The underbelly of all of these children's privacy laws are that there are bad actors out there who will use information in a bad way. So the less information there out there about your children, the better. There are people who use social security numbers of children because they know that no one's going to check that social security number until that child's of age and working. So another thing that I will advocate for is checking your credit reports, checking your child's credit report to see if somebody's using that to, check the social security number. Those things are important to do on at least an annual basis. And you have the ability to go to annualcreditreport.com. Again, that's annualcreditreport.com. It is a government website. It's through the 3 credit bureaus. You can get a free report. It's not a scam. It's different than some of the ones that you may have heard a jingle on TV about. But annualcreditreport.com will allow you to pull a credit report for free from the 3 major bureaus. You can do it for your child as well. Again, you can space those out. You could do it at your dental appointment and get one, and then 6 months later get another one. And then you'll always be able to constantly check your credit to see if there's accounts out there that are using your information without your consent.
Right. Yeah. Going back to that question about why some people may not want to post their children's images. I don't know if you've tried it. I've tried it before, but anybody can download any picture off of a lot of these social media websites.
Yeah.
You could just click save image and boom, it's in my phone.
Yep. And you've seen, not to freak everybody out, but you've seen those issues where somebody has taken down a photo or downloaded a photo of a child, maybe with cancer, and then set up a GoFundMe. And it's not somebody who's affiliated with that child. They're exploiting that child. So we really want to avoid situations like that. You're right. On Facebook and on other media, you can just sort of right click and download it, and then it go on your phone or on your computer, and you can repost that photo anywhere. So another thing to think about too is location data that's saved with those photos, the metadata that goes along with a photo that may show your home address or the park that you were at where you took it, or that you were at Disneyland. I generally advocate for people turning off their location services unless it's an app where you need it, like Waze or Google Maps or something like that, because you don't need, back in the day when we took photos, you never got them developed right away, but you had to figure out where was this photo, and you'd write it on the back. That's as best as we could do with location services back, when I was a kid. But I think it's important to realize that there's a digital footprint that goes with a lot of those items, and you can't control that metadata, that embedded data that goes with something like that. So with the children's faces, you can also decide whether you want to use your child's full name on social media. Maybe it makes sense to refer to your child by their initial, or something like that. Or some people can make the choice to just keep their children off social media altogether and ask relatives, please don't post photos of my child. Again, communicating that in advance is always a better way to go than having to police the internet and take things down later. So
cool. Well, I feel like we've kept you here for a long time. There was so much good information. I know that you are the one who's responsible for writing all of those privacy notices that we don't read, because that's just kind of human nature. So you've given us a couple of tips like Common Sense Media, annualcreditreport.com. What are some other tips that you can give us that, in a time crunched world, maybe we can do in one evening or, in a short period of time?
Yeah, I think along with, using Common Sense Media to sort of vet new apps and websites that you're looking at, that's a great one. datacloud.oracle.com to sort of stop some of the third-party advertising. But again, it may not stop the advertising altogether. What it will do is stop the targeted advertising. So you may actually not want that. Maybe you don't want there to be screwdriver ads in your feed when you didn't Google a screwdriver, or maybe you want ads for men's clothing and not women's clothing. Those things come from a profile about you. If you delete that information, you might get both. So there's things to think about there. Going to the FTC website, they have a really good consumer website, consumer.ftc.gov. And if you've had an identity theft or issue like that, it actually has a whole series of checklists on what you can do if you've been breached. It's a good read just to check it out. Using a private browser as an alternative to Google, when you are getting fed all those ads based on your Google searches, there are private browsers that you can use. You can use an incognito mode on Google Chrome. If you go up to the three dots on the side, you can go into incognito mode and it will mask your browsing. You can also use private browsers like DuckDuckGo. It's like DuckDuckGoose, but just duckduckgo.com. It has an app, it has a website, and DuckDuckGo will allow you to privately browse the internet and ask your questions and not have it show up in your child's feed. So things to think about. Secure mail, using paid versions like we talked about of different apps. You can buy a G Suite instead of just Google Mail. There may be additional security things there. There's a great end-to-end encrypted email that's free, actually, called Proton Mail, Proton mail.com. I think the more that people start to migrate over to those secure functions, it will make their lives a little bit easier. We all know that Yahoo's had breaches, Gmail's had breaches, and we all probably still have those email addresses existing somewhere. It may be time to retire those and pick a new one. Using password managers too. I advocate for this a lot. It's impossible to remember all your passwords. We know that, but you have so many free options for password managers, from your iCloud keychain to LastPass or OnePass, or even your Norton Security may have a password manager. The benefit of those is that they actually go through and they'll sort of look at your other passwords and see if you're using the same password on multiple sites. It may tell you like, hey, you should probably change one of these. They will also generate passwords for you, and you can store them in the app. You will still have to remember a master password, but it may be very helpful. Also, again, this depends on your level of trust with your spouse or your family members, but we've installed those things on my parents' computers, right? Because my father has trouble remembering his passwords. So if you install it on their computer, it may be an easier way for your parents to keep things secure, or even your children to keep things secure. You can get family accounts for LastPass and OnePass. But I think that may help. We also have a situation where one of my in-laws constantly forgets his password. And so he's typing a password sometimes into the search bar or into the Facebook status. And then all of a sudden now he's broadcast his password out to all the people in his feed. So if you have a one-click kind of a thing where there's a master password and they can do that, it may stave off a lot of the inadvertent disclosure of information. So to think about that for sure.
Great. Thank you for all of the information that you've given us. I mean, I found it very helpful. I hope that everybody else found it helpful too. If anybody out there has additional questions, you can email us. There's my email address and Diana's. And feel free to ask us any questions regarding cybersecurity, privacy law, data privacy, all of the above. And hope everybody has a great rest of your day. Thank you, Diana, for joining us.
Thanks, Wendy. This was really fun. I had a great time. I hope everybody stays safe out there and stays healthy.
Great. Thank you.